The room was silent, except for the clinking of silverware and the soft hum of the jazz band in the corner. The restaurant was a beacon of elegance, with polished marble floors reflecting the soft glow of crystal chandeliers. Guests sat in white linen suits, swirling glasses of expensive wine, and discussing business deals worth millions. At the head of one table sat Derek Caldwell, a billionaire CEO with a reputation built on ruthless negotiations and even sharper instincts. His gaze swept over the room with the air of someone who knew his place at the top. He was a man who built an empire through intimidation, who saw people as tools to be used and discarded. He leaned back in his chair, his voice low but clearly audible to anyone within earshot, as he addressed the newest addition to the staff. "They teach wine in your neighborhood?" He sneered, eyes glinting with superiority. The words hung in the air like a sharp slap, a calculated jab at her background, her upbringing, and her worth. Everyone at the table fell silent, eyes flicking to the woman standing at the side of the table. Naomi Ellis, the waitress, stood still, her hands steady as she balanced the tray of wine glasses. The words of Derek Caldwell were harsh, but they were nothing new. She had heard worse in her life, though not often from men like him. She knew what it was like to be underestimated, to be looked down upon because of where she came from. Derek's words weren't just an insult. They were the kind of remark she had heard time and time again. She had spent her life proving others wrong, but tonight, this moment, this man would be different. Naomi's eyes remained calm, her posture perfect. She didn't flinch. She didn't react. Instead, she simply smiled, a faint, practiced curve of her lips. The silence at the table was palpable, thick with expectation. Derek waited for her to break, for her to cower under his derision, but Naomi's response wasn't the one he was prepared for. As she refilled the wine glasses at the table, she caught his eye, her smile not faltering for a second. "I know more about wine than you think," she said, her voice calm but confident. The room held its breath. Derek blinked, taken aback. His smirk faltered, and for a split second, the arrogance in his eyes faded. He hadn't expected her to respond, let alone with such quiet assurance. Naomi knew the wines. She knew the best pairings, the complex notes of a vintage, the delicate process of fermentation. She wasn't just a waitress who served food and poured drinks. She was a woman who had earned every piece of knowledge she possessed, every moment she stood in this restaurant. She wasn't here because she had to be. She was here because she chose to be. And she chose to stand her ground. The tension in the room thickened as Naomi Ellis stood motionless, the weight of Derek Caldwell's sneer still hanging in the air. She could feel the eyes of the room shift toward her, but she refused to let their gaze unsettle her. She had been underestimated her entire life, and yet here she stood, holding her ground with the quiet dignity that she had spent years cultivating. Derek was the kind of man who ruled with arrogance, whose wealth had given him the belief that he could control anyone in his path. Naomi, however, had never been one to bow to authority, especially not to someone like him. She had learned early on that respect was something you earned, not something you demanded with money and power. Naomi's journey wasn't one of privilege. It was one shaped by hardship, by the streets she grew up on, and by the sacrifices she had made to get to where she was. Raised by a single mother in a neighborhood where dreams often felt out of reach, Naomi knew what it was like to have people dismiss her based on the color of her skin and her background. She had fought for everything she had, and tonight was no different. The quiet of the room only heightened the intensity of the moment. Derek, clearly surprised by her response, leaned forward in his chair, narrowing his eyes at her. He was used to people cowering in his presence, to people shrinking under the weight of his judgment. But Naomi wasn't just any person. She had worked hard to get to this point, to learn, to grow, and to prove that she was more than what others saw on the surface. With her calm demeanor, she made it clear that she wasn't afraid of him, that she wouldn't let his words define her. As she continued to serve, she glanced at the other waitstaff in the room, all of whom had kept their distance from Derek. They knew the drill. Avoid confrontation, stay in the background, and keep things running smoothly. But Naomi wasn't like them. She wasn't going to let a man like Derek push her around, not anymore. She had seen too much of this in her life, people being silenced, dismissed, and walked over by those who thought they were untouchable. She wouldn't be one of them. Derek, noticing the shift in her attitude, let out a small laugh, trying to regain control of the situation. He didn't like being challenged, especially by someone like her. He was used to having people admire him, to have them fawn over his wealth and power. But Naomi's unflinching composure threw him off. It made him uncomfortable. It made him realize that he wasn't the one in control here. Naomi didn't engage with his childish taunts. She simply moved around the table with a quiet elegance, refilling wine glasses and setting down dishes with a grace that seemed to take everyone by surprise. It was clear she wasn't going to back down. And just as Derek thought he had regained his footing, she spoke again. "I know more about wine than you think," she said, her voice steady and confident, without a hint of insecurity. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Derek found himself speechless. The room seemed to hold its breath. He wasn't used to being called out like this, especially not by someone he considered beneath him. Naomi's words were not just a simple correction, they were a declaration of her worth, her knowledge, and her refusal to be belittled. She wasn't just a waitress. She was someone who had earned her place at that table, and tonight, she was going to make sure that everyone knew it. As Naomi continued to move gracefully around the table, the quiet of the room intensified, and Derek Caldwell's eyes followed her every step. His smirk had faded, replaced by a look of confusion, but he refused to let his discomfort show. He prided himself on his control, and he had never been one to back down. But Naomi was different. She wasn't just another waitress to ignore and belittle. She wasn't going to bend to his will like the others had. Derek Caldwell was the kind of man who had always been at the top, and he had spent his entire career getting there by crushing anyone who dared to challenge him. He had built his empire on manipulation and power, and no one ever questioned his authority. His company, Caldwell Enterprises, had risen to prominence through ruthless business moves and strategic dominance in the global market. But sitting across from Naomi, Derek was starting to feel something unfamiliar. She wasn't intimidated by him. She wasn't buying into the performance of wealth and status that he so carefully projected. And for the first time in a long while, Derek wasn't sure of himself. Naomi's response had thrown him off. It wasn't the kind of reaction he was used to. People typically apologized, shrank back, or laughed nervously when faced with his arrogance. But Naomi stood her ground with calm assurance, as though she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. As she moved between the tables, her every action was deliberate, filled with purpose. She wasn't performing for Derek or anyone else in the room. She was doing her job, but more than that, she was showing him something he had never seen before: self-respect. Naomi had learned early on that if you wanted to survive in this world, you had to show up with dignity, even when the world tried to take it from you. She had spent years working to get where she was, not because of a desire for fame or recognition, but because she had something to prove, not to others, but to herself. She had seen how people in power used their position to dismiss those beneath them, how their words cut deeper than any physical wound. She had seen it in the way people treated her mother, a woman who had worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. Naomi knew what it was like to be invisible, but she wasn't going to let that happen to her anymore. Not tonight. She had worked too hard to let anyone define her. As Derek sat back, still trying to regain control of the situation, Naomi glanced at the other waitstaff who had been quietly watching from the periphery. They knew the unspoken rule: never engage with the customers too much, never challenge them, and always keep your head down. But Naomi wasn't like them. She wasn't going to let Derek's wealth and arrogance dictate how she felt about herself. She wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't afraid of anyone. She had learned that fear only held you back. Fear made you small, made you doubt your worth. But Naomi wasn't small. She was larger than life in a way that Derek couldn't even begin to understand. Her quiet confidence, her calm composure, it all spoke volumes in a way that words never could. Derek watched as she continued her work, and despite his growing discomfort, he couldn't help but feel a grudging respect for her. He had underestimated her. And in that moment, he realized that he wasn't the one in control anymore. Naomi had just turned the tables. The balance of power had shifted, and it was no longer in Derek's favor. The other diners at the table seemed to feel the change in the air too. They had expected Naomi to break under Derek's harsh treatment, to falter in the face of his arrogance. But instead, she had stood her ground, unshaken and resolute. And in doing so, she had earned their respect, even if they didn't fully understand it yet. Derek, however, was still trying to process the situation. He had been so sure that his wealth, his status, would intimidate her. But now, as he watched Naomi, something within him began to crack. He wasn't the one with all the power here. It was Naomi. And he knew, deep down, that he had just made a mistake he couldn't take back. As Naomi continued to move through the room, Her calm composure seemed to unsettle Derek even further. The tension in the air was palpable, but Naomi remained unflinching, her eyes steady, her movements graceful as she refilled glasses and set down plates. Derek Caldwell, the billionaire CEO, had built his empire on power and intimidation. He was used to commanding respect with just a look, used to having people bow to his will, both in the boardroom and in everyday life. But Naomi Ellis, the waitress, had disrupted that dynamic in a way he hadn't expected. Derek's mind raced as he tried to regain control of the situation. He had always prided himself on his ability to read people, to manipulate situations to his advantage. Yet, Naomi was different. She wasn't intimidated by him. She didn't care about his wealth, his status, or his influence. She wasn't here to be impressed by his power. The more he watched her, the more he realized that she wasn't just a waitress, she was someone with dignity, someone who had earned her place in this world, and someone who refused to be treated like less than anyone else in that room. The silence grew heavier as the evening wore on. Derek leaned back in his chair, trying to regain some semblance of authority. He watched Naomi closely, scrutinizing every move she made. He had expected her to crack under the pressure, to apologize for her boldness, to shrink back into the role of a subordinate, but she didn't. She simply continued her work, moving with an air of quiet strength that seemed to command attention without ever demanding it. Naomi had long ago learned that in a world where people were quick to judge and dismiss, the only way to survive was to maintain control over her own self-respect. She had worked too hard to get to this point to let anyone take that away from her. The other diners at the table were starting to notice the shift in the room. They had been waiting for her to falter, but instead, they saw a woman who was standing her ground, unyielding and confident. It wasn't lost on them that Naomi had refused to be cowed by a man who had spent his entire life getting what he wanted by intimidating others. The power dynamic was changing, and it was clear that Naomi was no longer the one in the background. Derek had been the one in charge until now, but Naomi's quiet defiance had turned the tables. The more she moved through the room, the more it became evident that she was not just a waitress. She was someone who commanded respect, who had the knowledge and strength to face the very people who thought they could belittle her. Derek's frustration simmered beneath the surface, but he refused to show it. He continued with his charade of confidence, offering the occasional forced smile, and attempting to dominate the conversation with his talk of business deals and acquisitions. But it was all just noise now. Naomi had already won, not through words, but through the simple act of standing firm. Derek's discomfort grew as the evening progressed. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. He had been in countless situations like this before, but this was different. For the first time, he wasn't the one in control. It was Naomi. As the dinner wore on, it became clear that the dynamics in the room had shifted. Derek, the billionaire CEO who had spent his entire career bending others to his will, was now the one who felt small. He had been outplayed not by force, but by dignity, by the simple act of someone refusing to be disrespected. Naomi's strength wasn't loud, it wasn't in your face, but it was undeniable. And Derek, for all his power, had no choice but to acknowledge it. The tension in the room was almost unbearable, but Naomi Ellis remained calm, unfazed by the growing discomfort of Derek Caldwell, the billionaire CEO who had once commanded the space with his wealth and arrogance. Derek, still trying to maintain his control, leaned forward, his steely gaze fixed on Naomi, but he was now struggling to maintain his usual confidence. Naomi wasn't like the others he had encountered in his career. She wasn't afraid, she wasn't intimidated, and most of all, she wasn't playing his game. Derek had always been in control, always the one who dictated the terms of every interaction, but Naomi had shifted the balance in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't through loud words or dramatic gestures. It was through her quiet dignity, her refusal to shrink in the face of his power. As the evening wore on, Naomi continued to move with grace, effortlessly going about her duties. She wasn't there to impress anyone, certainly not Derek, but there was something in the way she carried herself that made the entire room take notice. Her presence, though understated, demanded respect. As Derek sat back, his frustration growing, he couldn't help but feel that he was losing control of the situation. He had been trying to negotiate a business deal, but Naomi's refusal to back down had thrown him off. His mind raced, and for the first time in a long while, he couldn't find the words to assert his dominance. Naomi wasn't just a waitress. She was a symbol of strength, a reminder that respect couldn't be bought with money or power. Derek, who had spent his career silencing people with his wealth, now found himself rendered speechless by the very person he had dismissed as inconsequential. The guests at the table, who had been silent witnesses to the exchange, now seemed to be shifting their attention. No one had expected Naomi to stand up to Derek the way she had, and now they were starting to see her in a new light. The quiet, composed woman who had served their meals with grace was no longer just part of the background. She was someone who had earned her place at that table, someone who had stood firm in the face of a man who had tried to belittle her. As Derek continued to seethe in frustration, Naomi caught his eye again, her gaze steady and unwavering. There was no animosity in her eyes, only quiet confidence. She wasn't angry, she wasn't upset. She was simply resolute in her belief that she deserved respect, just like anyone else in that room. Derek, still trying to salvage his pride, leaned forward once again, his voice slightly more strained than before. "You're quite bold," he said, the edge of mockery still evident in his tone. Naomi smiled slightly, her response calm and measured. "I'm not bold," she replied. "I'm just standing up for what's right." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Derek found himself at a loss. He had spent his entire career building an empire by playing people against each other, by using his power to manipulate and control. But Naomi wasn't a pawn in his game. She wasn't going to be moved by his wealth, his reputation, or his attempts to intimidate. And as the evening progressed, it became clear to everyone in the room that Naomi had not just earned their respect, she had earned the right to be heard. Derek's mind raced, but there was no escaping the fact that he had misjudged her. He had underestimated her strength, her intelligence, and her unwillingness to be silenced. And in that moment, Derek Caldwell knew that he had been outplayed not by his wealth, not by his business acumen, but by the quiet, unwavering strength of a woman who refused to be treated like less than anyone else. The room was heavy with silence, broken only by the soft clink of silverware as the dinner carried on. Derek Caldwell, the billionaire CEO, sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He had been caught off guard by Naomi's calm confidence, and the realization was starting to settle in that this was no ordinary waitress. She had seen through his facade, and now, he was the one left unsettled. Naomi, on the other hand, moved with the same grace and confidence that had earned her the right to stand her ground. She wasn't doing this for applause, for recognition, or even for validation. She was doing it because she had nothing to prove to anyone but herself. The power dynamics in the room had shifted, and Naomi could feel the eyes of the other diners on her, a mix of surprise, admiration, and even a hint of respect. Derek had tried to use his wealth, his position, to silence her, to belittle her. But now, it was clear to everyone that Naomi wasn't someone who could be silenced. As she continued to serve, Derek tried to regain control of the situation. He attempted to steer the conversation back to business, to the deals he was here to finalize, but his voice lacked the same authority it once had. Naomi's quiet strength had chipped away at his armor, and now, he found himself questioning whether his usual tactics would work. "So, Naomi," Derek finally said, his tone more forced than usual, "I must admit, I didn't expect that kind of response from you. I was simply trying to keep the conversation light." Naomi turned to him, her expression unchanged. "It's not about the conversation, Derek. It's about respect. I don't need to prove anything to you. I've earned my place here, just like you've earned yours." The words hung in the air, powerful and clear. Derek had nothing to say in response. His usual arrogance, his usual need to dominate, had been rendered useless. For the first time in his career, he had encountered someone who didn't bend to his will. Naomi didn't back down. She didn't apologize for standing her ground. She didn't need to. Derek's discomfort was palpable now, his usual sharp confidence replaced by a rare sense of vulnerability. The other diners, who had been quietly observing, were beginning to take notice. They had expected Naomi to break, to crumble under the pressure of dealing with someone like Derek, but she hadn't. She had stood her ground, with quiet dignity, and it was changing the way everyone in the room saw her. Derek shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable, but Naomi paid him no mind. She had nothing left to prove. The evening wore on, but the power had shifted. Derek had underestimated her, just as so many others had underestimated people like her. But Naomi was a force to be reckoned with. She had never needed anyone to validate her worth. She knew it. And now, Derek knew it too. Naomi's presence in that room, her calm composure in the face of his aggression, had spoken louder than any words ever could. Derek sat back, defeated by the quiet strength of the woman he had tried to dismiss. He had lost, not just the power struggle, but the very respect he had always thought he commanded so effortlessly. And as Naomi continued to move gracefully through the room, Derek realized that, for once, he wasn't the most powerful person in the room. The game had changed, and Naomi Ellis had won. As Naomi continued to serve the table with an air of quiet confidence, the room fell into an unexpected hush. Derek Caldwell, the billionaire CEO who had long been accustomed to controlling every room he entered, sat frozen in his chair, staring at her in disbelief. His usual arrogance had given way to a strange feeling of powerlessness, and he couldn't quite figure out how it had happened. He had been so sure of himself, so confident in his ability to dominate those around him, but Naomi Ellis was not like the others he had encountered. She was different, and that difference had shaken him to his core. Naomi had been the target of his insults, but she had turned the tables in a way that Derek had never anticipated. She didn't argue, she didn't shout, and she certainly didn't back down. Instead, she simply stood her ground. It was that quiet strength, that unyielding resolve, that had disarmed him. Derek tried to regain control of the situation, but the more he tried, the more he realized that the power he thought he held over Naomi was slipping away. He had underestimated her, dismissed her as just another waitress who would cower under his gaze. But Naomi wasn't like that. She had worked too hard, overcome too many obstacles, to let anyone treat her as less than she was worth. Derek sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He had always prided himself on his ability to read people, to manipulate situations to his advantage. But Naomi had not only seen through his facade, she had shattered it. She had exposed him for what he truly was, a man who thought his wealth and status gave him the right to treat others as inferior. As Naomi moved silently around the table, she didn't just serve the food or pour the wine. She served something far more important: dignity. Her actions spoke louder than any words ever could. She had stood up to him, not with aggression or anger, but with calm confidence, and that had left a deeper impact than Derek could have ever imagined. The other diners at the table, who had been quietly observing the exchange, were now beginning to shift their gaze. It wasn't lost on them that Naomi had refused to be intimidated by Derek's wealth or power. She had done what no one else in the room had dared to do. She had stood up for herself. They had expected her to cower, to shrink back, but instead, she had risen above it all, and in doing so, she had gained their respect. Derek, however, was still struggling to process what had just happened. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion and frustration. He had built his empire on the idea that money and status could control others, that he could dictate the terms of any interaction. But Naomi had just proved him wrong. She wasn't just a waitress. She was a woman who commanded respect through her strength and integrity. As the dinner continued, Derek found himself unable to focus. His usual sharp mind had dulled, his confidence shattered. Naomi's quiet defiance had left him questioning everything he thought he knew about power and control. He had thought he was the one who held all the cards, but now, it seemed that Naomi was the one holding the winning hand. The room had changed, the dynamic had shifted. Derek was no longer the most powerful person in the room. Naomi had taken that title, not through force or confrontation, but through the simple act of standing her ground. And as the night drew to a close, it was clear that Naomi had won not just the battle, but the respect of everyone in that room, including Derek himself. The evening came to an unexpected close, and as the last plates were cleared away, the atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically. Derek Caldwell, once the undisputed power in the room, now sat quietly, his earlier bravado completely dissolved. He had come to the dinner with one goal in mind: to seal a high-profile business deal, but instead, he had found himself outmatched by someone he had underestimated. Naomi Ellis, the waitress who had stood her ground against him, had not only earned his respect but had also turned the entire room's perception upside down. Derek sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. He had been so sure of himself earlier, but now he realized that no amount of money or status could give him control over Naomi. It was a bitter pill to swallow. Naomi had exposed him in a way that no one had ever dared to. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't thrown a tantrum. She had simply shown him that respect and dignity couldn't be bought, and it certainly couldn't be demanded. They had spent the evening navigating around the elephant in the room, the growing realization that the man who had always played the power game was now the one left powerless. Naomi had won, but not in the way anyone expected. The night's events had unfolded slowly, each moment adding to the undeniable truth that Naomi's strength didn't come from her position, but from her character. As the final toast was made, Derek felt a shift in the air, a sense of humbling realization. He had expected to dominate the evening, to walk away with the deal in his pocket, but instead, he had lost something far more valuable, his sense of superiority. Naomi had taken that from him with one quiet act of defiance. As he looked around the room, Derek could see the respect in the eyes of the other guests. They had witnessed Naomi's quiet strength, and they had seen Derek, the mighty CEO, brought to his knees by a woman who refused to be treated as less. The evening had not just been about business, it had been a lesson in humility and respect. Naomi's presence had changed the course of the night, and it had changed Derek's perception of the world he had built. As the guests began to filter out of the room, Derek found himself face to face with Naomi one last time. He could feel the weight of the moment. She stood before him, still composed, still unshaken, but with a quiet strength that left him speechless. For the first time, he didn't know what to say. His usual bravado failed him, and for the first time in his life, he had no words. Naomi, sensing his vulnerability, simply nodded. "Good night, Derek," she said, her voice calm and steady. There was no bitterness in her words, no smug satisfaction. She had nothing to prove. She had already proven her worth. Derek opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He watched as Naomi walked away, her head held high, with the kind of dignity that could never be bought. The room, once filled with his laughter and confidence, was now filled with the lingering weight of the lesson he had learned. As the door closed behind Naomi, Derek sat in silence, the truth of the evening settling over him. For the first time, he realized that power, true power, was not about wealth, dominance, or control. It was about integrity. And Naomi Ellis had shown him that in the most unforgettable way possible. The next morning, Derek Caldwell woke up to the stark realization of what had transpired the night before. As he sat in his luxury penthouse, staring out at the city below, the events of the dinner played over and over in his mind. He had spent years building his empire, meticulously crafting an image of power and control. But it wasn't the deal he had signed, or the people he had impressed that he could not stop thinking about. It was Naomi, the waitress. He had thought she was nothing more than a cog in the machine, someone he could easily dismiss, someone whose life had no weight compared to his. But in just one evening, Naomi had done something Derek had never expected. She had exposed the emptiness of his power. She had shown him that true strength didn't come from wealth, didn't come from the deals he brokered, or the influence he wielded. It came from something deeper, something that came from within. Naomi's quiet dignity had cut through him in a way no business transaction or boardroom negotiation ever had. She hadn't needed to fight him or argue with him. She had simply stood her ground, and in doing so, she had taken from him the one thing he had taken for granted, his sense of control. That night, Derek had learned a lesson in humility, one that he could never have anticipated. He had always believed that money and power gave him the right to command respect, that his success was proof of his superiority. But Naomi had reminded him that respect is earned not through dominance or intimidation, but through integrity, character, and the courage to stand up for what's right. Derek sat back in his chair, a new understanding slowly settling within him. His empire, as vast as it was, had no value if it was built on the foundation of fear and disrespect. Naomi hadn't just won the battle that night, she had won his respect. And for the first time, Derek realized that maybe that was the most important victory of all. As he reflected on the events, Derek knew that he would never forget the lesson Naomi had taught him. He would never forget how she had stood her ground, how she had quietly dismantled his arrogance, and how, in a single evening, she had earned something far more valuable than any business deal. She had earned his admiration. As the days passed, Derek found himself thinking more and more about Naomi. He had encountered many powerful people in his life, but none had ever affected him the way she had. He began to see the world differently, to recognize the importance of integrity and fairness in his business dealings, to understand that power isn't about controlling others, it's about knowing when to listen, when to learn, and when to show respect. 1 week later, Derek reached out to Naomi. He asked her to meet him for coffee. When they sat down together, Derek offered a sincere apology for his behavior the night of the dinner. He admitted that he had been wrong, that he had let his arrogance cloud his judgment, and that Naomi had taught him a lesson he would never forget. Naomi listened quietly, her expression calm, but there was a slight smile on her face. a recognition that this moment was different than any apology she had ever received. Derek wasn't apologizing because he had to. He was apologizing because he had learned something that had changed him, something he couldn't ignore. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was simply acknowledging her strength. Naomi accepted his apology, her grace never wavering. "I appreciate your words, Derek," she said, her voice calm. "But the respect, the change, it's not something you owe me, it's something you owe yourself." In that moment, Derek understood. The real transformation wasn't about him making amends with Naomi, it was about the transformation within himself. He had finally understood that true power wasn't in controlling others. It was in recognizing their worth, standing up for them, and letting them stand for themselves. As Naomi stood to leave, Derek watched her walk out of the cafe, head held high. And in that moment, Derek Caldwell, the billionaire CEO, knew that he had learned something far more valuable than any business deal or corporate merger. He had learned the true meaning of respect. In this powerful tale of transformation, a billionaire CEO is humbled by a courageous waitress who refuses to be dismissed, showing how respect and dignity cannot be bought or manipulated. As the story unfolds, Derek Caldwell, a man used to controlling every room he enters with his wealth and power, faces a challenge unlike any he has encountered before. Naomi Ellis, the waitress, calmly stands her ground against his arrogance, teaching him a valuable lesson about true strength and integrity. This is one of many Black stories that reveal how quiet dignity can topple even the mightiest of empires. Naomi's calm response to Derek's insults shifts the power dynamic in the room, and her courage earns her not just respect but admiration. Derek, who built his empire on dominance, learns that respect must be earned, not forced. As the night progresses, Naomi's resilience exposes the emptiness of Derek's power, and he comes to a humbling realization. Black stories like this one serve as reminders that true power lies in one's ability to remain grounded and humble, even when faced with those who think they are untouchable. In the end, Derek recognizes Naomi's worth, not through grand gestures, but through the simple act of standing up for herself. This story, like many others, shows how Black stories challenge societal norms and highlight the strength of character that can change everything. Naomi's quiet dignity challenges everything Derek thought he knew about power, showing that strength often comes from within, and that the most valuable lessons are not taught in boardrooms, but in moments like these,